Reuben Sachs, A Sketch, by Amy Levy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reuben Sachs by Amy Levy, read by Adrian Pretzelis. Chapter 11. I do not like this manner of a dance, this game of 2 and 2. It were much better to mix between the pauses than to sit, each lady out of earshot, with her friend. Swinburne, Chastelard. The Lunningers were giving a dance at the beginning of November, and the female part of the household was greatly taken up with preparations for the event. There was much revising of invitation lists, discussion of the social claims of their friends and acquaintance, and the usual anxious beating up of every available dancing man. "Addie will bring Mr. Griffiths and Esther Mr. Peck," said Rose. "They go well, look nice, and everyone sees them everywhere, although Reuben calls them outsiders." Rose loved dances, as well she might, for from the first she had been a success. Rose, with her fair plump shoulders and blonde hair, her high spirits and good nature, her nimble feet and nimble tongue. Rose, with her £50,000 and 20-guinea ball gowns. Rose went down, magic phrase, as not one girl in 10 succeeds in doing. "I suppose," said Judith, "that the Samuel Saxes will have to be asked." She, though of course she had her admirers, was by no means such a success as her cousin. "Yes, isn't it a nuisance?" cried Rose. "And the Lazarus Harts." If there is a strong family feeling among the children of Israel, it takes often the form of acute family jealousy. The Jew who will open his doors in reckless ignorance to every sort and condition of Gentile is morbidly sensitive as regards the social standing of the compatriot whom he admits to his hospitality. The Lunningers, as we know, were not people of long standing in the community, and numbered among their acquaintance Jews of every rank and shade, from the Cardozos, who were rich, cultivated, could almost trace their descent from Hillel, the son of David, and had a footing in English society, to such children of nature as the Samuel Saxes. "We must have Nellie Hepburn and the Strettle girls," went on Rose, consulting her list. "The men all rush at them, though I don't see that they're so pretty myself." "I suppose they make a change from ourselves," answered Judith, smiling, "whose faces are known by heart." Judith was entering with spirit, with a zeal that was almost feverish, into the preparations for the forthcoming festivity. She and Reuben had scarcely spoken to one another since the Day of Atonement. They had met once or twice at family gatherings, at which, either by accident or design on Reuben's part, there had been no opportunity for private conversation. Perhaps an instinctive feeling that the old relations were imperilled, and that no new ones could ever be so satisfactory, held them apart. Meanwhile, Judith unconsciously fixed her mind on the one definite fact that Reuben would be at the Lunningers' dance. It was in the crowded solitude of ball-rooms that they had hitherto found their best opportunity. The night, so much prepared for, came round at last, and the house in Kensington Palace Gardens became, for the time being, the scene of ceaseless activity. Ernest had gone away into the country with the person who was always talked of as his valet, and Leo, of course, was in Cambridge, but the rest of the family, not excepting Lionel and Sidney, who handed programmes, had mustered in great force to do honour to the event. From an early hour poor Mrs. Lunninger had taken up her station in the doorway of the primrose-coloured dining-room, where she stood dejectedly welcoming her guests. She was wearing a quantity of valuable lace, very much crumpled, and had a profusion of diamonds scattered about her person, but had apparently forgotten to do her hair. Rose, in short voluminous skirts of pink tulle, and a pale pink satin bodice fitting close about her plump person, defining the lines of her ample hips, was performing introductions with noisy zeal with the help of Jack Quijano, whom she constituted her aide-de-camp. The Montague Cohens had come early, and Adelaide, in a very grand gown, scrutinized the scene with breathless interest, secretly wondering why more people had not asked her to dance. Judith was looking very well. Her short diaphanous white ball gown, with its low-cut, tight-fitting satin bodice, was not exactly a dignified garment, but she managed to maintain, in spite of it, her customary air of stateliness. Moreover, to-night some indefinable change had come over the character of her beauty, heightening it, intensifying it, giving it new life and colour. The calm, unawakened look which many people had found so baffling had left her face. The eyes, always curiously mournful, shone out with a new soft fire. Bertie Lee Harrison, tripping jauntily into the ballroom, remained transfixed a moment in excited admiration. What a beautiful woman was this cousin or pseudo-cousin of Sax's! How infinitely better bred she seemed than the people surrounding her. The Quijanos, as Reuben had told him, were Sephardim, for whose claim to birth he had the greatest respect. But as for that red-headed young man, her brother, there were no marks of breeding about him. Bertie was puzzled, as the stranger is so often puzzled, by the violent contrasts which exist among Jews, even in the case of members of the same family. Judith was standing some way off, where Bertie stood observing her, while 2 or 3 men wrote their names on her dancing card. She was one of the very few people of her race who look well in a crowd or at a distance. The charms of person which a Jew or Jewess may possess are not usually such as will bear the test of being regarded as a whole. Some quite commonplace English girls and men who were here to-night looked positively beautiful as they moved about among the ill-made sons and daughters of Shem, whose interesting faces gain so infinitely on a nearer view, even where it is a case of genuine good looks. Bertie waited a minute till the men had moved off, then advanced to Miss Quijano and humbly asked for 2 dances. Judith gave them to him with a smile. He was a poor creature, certainly, but he was Reuben's friend, and she knew that, in one way at least, Reuben thought well of him. He was one of the few Gentiles of her acquaintance whom he had not stigmatized as an outsider. Moreover, Bertie's little air of deference was a pleasant change from the rather patronizing attitude of the young men of her set, whose number was very limited, and who were aggressively conscious of commanding the market. Bertie, his dances secured, moved off regretfully. He would have liked to sue for further favours, but his sense of decorum restrained him. Had he but known it, he might, without exciting notice, have claimed a third, at least, of the dances on Judith's card. Hard flirtation was the order of the day, and the chaperones, who were few in number, gossiped comfortably together, while their charges sat out half the night with the same partner. Rose fell upon Bertie at this point, and fired him off like a gun at 1 or 2 partnerless damsels, while Judith, her partner in her wake, moved over to the doorway where Adelaide was standing with Caroline Cardozo. It was 11 o'clock, and Reuben had not come. Judith had, it must be owned, changed her position with a view to consulting the hall clock, and perhaps Adelaide had some inkling of this, for she said very loudly to her companion, "It is a first night at the Talion. My brother never misses one. I don't expect we shall see him to-night. Young men have so many ways of amusing themselves. I wonder they care about dances at all." The musicians struck up a fresh waltz, and Bertie came over to claim the first of his dances with Judith. He danced very nicely, in a straightforward, unambitious way, never reversing his partner round a corner without saying, "I beg your pardon." Esther, her sharp brown shoulders shuffling restlessly in and out of a gold-coloured gown of moire silk, with a string of pearls around her neck worth a king's ransom, surveyed the scene with shrewd, miserable eyes, while rattling on aimlessly to her partner and protégé, Mr. Peck. It was indeed a motley throng which was whirling and laughing and shouting across the music in the bare, bright, flower-scented apartment. The great majority of the people were Jews, Jews belonging to varying shades of caste and clique in that socially sensitive community. But besides these, there was a goodly contingent of Gentile dancing men, outsiders, according to Reuben, every one, and a smaller band of Gentile ladies, who were the fashion of the hour among the sons of Shem. "Bad form" was the label affixed by Reuben to these attractive maids and matrons. To give distinction to the scene, there were a well-known R.A. who had painted Rose's portrait for last year's Academy, 2 or 3 pretty actresses, an ex-Lord Mayor who had been knighted while in office, and last, though by no means least in the eyes of the clannish children of Israel, Caroline Cardozo and her father. "What a pretty girl, did you say?" remarked Esther as the music died away. "Yes, Judith Quijano is very good-looking, but I don't know that she goes down particularly well." Mr. Peck made some complimentary remark of a general character as to the beauty of Jewish ladies. "Yes, we have some pretty women," Esther answered, "but our men, no. The Jew, unlike the horse, is not a noble animal." Esther, it will be seen, was of those who walk naked and are not ashamed. At this point, a fashionably late hour, a new arrival was announced, and in marched Netta and Alex Sachs, their heads very much in the air, the self-assertion of self-distrust written on every line of their ingenuous countenances. Netta, who had had a new dress from Paris for the occasion, really looked rather well in her own style, which was of the exuberant, black-haired, highly coloured kind, and was at once greeted by one of the outsiders as an old friend. This was no less a person than Adelaide's particular protégé, Mr. Griffiths, who, ignorant of the fine shades of community class distinction, engaged Miss Sachs for several dances under the eyes of his mortified patroness. Mr. Griffiths, indeed, was an impartial person, who, so long as you gave him a good floor, a decent supper, and a partner who could go, would lend the light of his presence to any ballroom whatever, whether situated in South Kensington or Maida Vale. Alex Sachs was less fortunate than his sister. There were plenty of men, and the girls whom he thought worthy of inviting to dance, for the most part, declared themselves engaged. This was a new experience to him. His skilful dancing, it was of the acrobatic or gymnastic order, his powers of chaff and repartee, above all, his reputation as a parti, had secured him a high place among the maidens of Maida Vale. He stood now, his back to the wall, an air of contempt for the whole proceeding written on his florid face, exclaiming loudly and petulantly to his sister whenever he had the opportunity, "They don't introduce! They don't introduce!" 12 o'clock was striking as Reuben Sachs stepped into the hall, which by this time was filling with couples sitting out, a few of them really enjoying themselves, a great majority gay with that rather spurious gaiety, that forcing of the note, which is so marked a characteristic of festivities. Sounds of waltz music were borne from the drawing-room, and the draped aperture of the doorway—the door itself had been removed—showed a capering throng of dancers of varying degrees of agility. Reuben advanced languidly. His face wore the mingled look of exhaustion and nerve tension which with him denoted great fatigue. It had been a long day. In and out of court all the morning, 2 committee meetings, political and philanthropical, respectively, later on, a hurried club dinner, and an interminable first night with hitches in the scene shifting and long waits between the acts. He had told himself over and over again that he would cut the dance at his uncle's, and here he was, alleging to himself as an excuse the impossibility of getting to sleep directly after the theatre. It was little more than a month that he had been home, and already his old enemy, insomnia, showed signs of being on the track. Reuben made his way to a position near the foot of the stairs, which afforded a good view of the ballroom. He could not see Judith, a circumstance which irritated him, as he did not wish to go in search of her. Beyond, in the crowded refreshment room, he had a glimpse of Rose, who was exceedingly friand, giggling behind a large pink ice, while Jack Quijano, a look of conscious waggishness on his face, dropped confidential remarks into her ear. Esther, on the stairs behind him, was delivering herself freely of cheap epigrams to an impecunious partner, and in a rose-lit recess was to be seen Montague Cohen, his pale, pompous, feeble face wreathed in smiles, enjoying himself hugely with a light-hearted matron from the Gentile camp. The whole scene was familiar enough to Reuben, who from his boyhood upward had taken part in the festivities of his tribe with their gorgeously gowned and bejewelled women, elaborate floral decorations, and costly suppers. The Jew, it may be remarked in passing, eats and dresses at least 2 or 3 degrees above his Gentile brother in the same rank of life. The music came to an end, and the dancers streamed out from the ballroom. Alex Sachs, who had been dancing with his sister, brushed past Reuben in the throng, and the latter was mechanically aware of hearing him say to his partner, "Mixed, very mixed, a scratch lot of people, I call it." Lionel Lunninger came rushing up to him in all the glory of an Eton suit and a white gardenia. "So you've come at last, Reuben. You are very late, and all the pretty girls are engaged. Have a programme?" Reuben did not answer. By this time the ballroom was almost empty, and he could see clearly into the room beyond, where a red cloth recess had been built in from the balcony. Chapter 11. Chapter 12. There are flashes struck from midnights, there are fire flames noondays kindle, whereby piled up honours perish, whereby swollen ambitions dwindle. Oh, observe! Of course, next moment the world's honours in derision, trampled out the light for ever. Browning, Christina. There were 2 people sitting there, to all appearance, completely absorbed in one another. In the distance, Judith's head bending slightly forward, her profile, the curves of her neck and bosom, and the white mass of her gown were to be seen clearly outlined against the red. And another figure, in close proximity to the first, defined itself against the same background. Reuben started. Judith and Lee Harrison! His apathy, his fatigue, his uncertainty as to seeking Judith vanished as by magic. Outwardly he looked impassive as ever as he strolled into the all but deserted ballroom. It would have taken a close observer to perceive the repressed intensity of his every movement. There was a draped alcove dividing the front and back drawing-rooms, where Caroline Cardoza and Adelaide were standing as Reuben sauntered towards them. "I hardly expected to see you," cried his sister, as Reuben stopped and greeted the ladies. Adelaide was not enjoying herself. Her social successes, such as they were not usually obtained in the open competition of the ballroom. "Am I too late for a dance?" asked Reuben, turning with deference to Miss Cardozo. She handed him her card with a faint smile. There were 2 or 3 vacant places on it. "A great fortune," I am quoting Esther, "though it always brings proposals of marriage, does not so invariably bring invitations to dance." Caroline Cardozo was a plain, thin, wistful girl, with a shy manner that some people mistook for stand-offishness, who was declared by the men of Lunninger's set to be without an atom of go. Her wealth and importance notwithstanding, she was, as Rose, in her capacity of hostess, explained, difficult to get rid of. Reuben, his dance duly registered, stood talking urbanely, while scrutinizing from beneath his lids the pair on the balcony. The nearer view showed him the unmistakable devotion on Bertie's little fair face, which was lifted close to Judith's. He appeared to be devouring her with his eyes. And Judith? It seemed to Reuben that never before had he seen that light in her eyes, never that flush on her soft cheek, never that strange, indescribable, almost passionate air in her pose, in her whole presence. His own heart was beating with a wild, incredulous anger, an astonished contempt. He must be careful of Judith, he to beware of engaging her feelings too deeply, he who after all these years had never been able to bring that look into her eyes. Bertie? It was impossible. In any case, with sudden vindictiveness, it was unlikely that Bertie himself meant anything, and yet he was just that sort of man to do an idiotic thing of the kind. The music struck up, and the dancers drifted back to the ballroom. Reuben, bowing himself away, turned to see Judith and her escort standing behind him, while the latter, gathering courage, wrote his name again and again on her card. Reuben remained a moment in doubt, then went straight up to her. "Good evening, Miss Quahano." There was a note of irony in his voice, a look of irony in his pale, tense face. The glance that he shot at her from his brilliant eyes was almost cruel. "Ah, good evening, Reuben." She gave a little gasp, thrilled, bewildered. Long ago her searching glance, travelling across the two crowded rooms, had distinguished the top of Reuben's head in the hall beyond. She knew just the way the hair grew, just the way it was lifted from the forehead in a sidelong crest, just the way it was beginning to get a little thin at the temples. Bertie moved off in search of his partner, with a bow and a reminder of future engagements. "May I have the pleasure of a dance?" Reuben retained his tone of ironical formality, but looking into her uplifted face his jealousy faded and was forgotten. She held up her card with a smile. It was quite full. Reuben took it gently from her hand, glanced at it, and tore it into fragments. Judith said not a word. To both of them the little act seemed fraught with strange significance, the beginning of a new phase in their mutual relations. Reuben gave her his arm in silence. She took it, half frightened, and he led her to the furthermost corner of the crimson recess. The dancers, overflowing from the ballroom beyond, closed about it, and they were screened from sight. Reuben leaned forward, looking at her with eyes that seemed literally alight with some inward flame. The precautions, the restraints, the reserves which had hitherto fenced in their intercourse were for the moment overthrown. Each was swept away on a current of feeling which was bearing them who knew whither. To Judith, Reuben was no longer a commodity of the market with a high price set on him. He was a piteous human creature who entreated her with his eyes, yet held her chained, her suppliant and her master. A soft wind blew in suddenly through the red curtains, and stirred the hair on Judith's forehead. "Aren't you cold?" Reuben broke the silence for the first time. "No, not at all." She smiled, then, holding back the red drapery with her hand, looked out into the night. The November air was damp, warm, and filled full of a yellow haze, which any but a Londoner would have called a fog. Across the yard and a half of garden which divided the house from the street she could see the long deserted thoroughfare with its double line of lamps, their flames shining dull through the mist. Reuben watched her. The clear curve of the lifted arm, the beautiful lines of the half-averted face stirred his already excited senses. "Judith!" She turned her face, with its almost ecstatic look, towards him, letting fall the curtains. There were some chrysanthemums like snowflakes in her bodice, scarcely showing against the white, and as she turned Reuben bent towards her and laid his hand on them. "I'm going to commit a theft," he said, and his low voice shook a little. Judith yielded, passive, rapt, as his fingers fumbled with the gold pin. It was like a dream to her, a wonderful dream, with which the whirling maze of dancers, the heavy scents, the delicious music were inextricably mingled, and mingling with it also was a strange harsh sound out in the street outside, which, faint and muffled at first, was growing every moment louder and more distinct. Reuben had just succeeded in releasing the flowers from their fastening, but he held them loosely, with doubtful fingers, realizing suddenly what he had done. Judith shivered, vaguely conscious of a change in the moral atmosphere. The noise in the street was very loud, and words could be distinguished. "What is it they are saying?" he cried, dropping the flowers, springing to the aperture and pulling back the curtain. Outside the house stood a dark figure, a narrow crackling sheet flung across one shoulder. A voice mounted up, clear in discordance through the mist. "Death of a Conservative MP! Death of the member for St. Baldwin's!" "Ah, what is it?" Cold, white, trembling, she too heard the words, and knew that they were her sentence. He turned towards her. On his face was the look of a man who has escaped a great danger. "Poor Ronaldson is dead. It has come suddenly at the last. No doubt I shall find a telegram at home." He spoke in his most everyday tones, but he did not look at her. She summoned all her strength, all her pride. "Then I suppose you will be going down there to-morrow?" Her voice never faltered. "No. In any case I must wait till after the funeral." He looked down stiffly. It was she who kept her presence of mind. "Don't you want to buy a paper and to tell Adelaide?" "If you will excuse me. Where shall I leave you?" "Oh, I will stop here. The dance is just over." He moved off awkwardly. She stood there, white and straight, and never moving. At her feet lay her own chrysanthemums, crushed by Reuben's departing feet. She picked them up and flung them into the street. At the same moment a voice sounded at her elbow. "I have found you at last." "Is this our dance, Mr. Lee Harrison?" Chapter 12